Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining the Google Consent Management Requirement Core Concepts webinar. My name is Sam. I'm a global product lead here at Google. I focus on AdSense, Ad Manager, and AdMob, so our sell-side products, which you all are users of. And today we have kind of three goals for this webinar. One is to review the core concepts behind Google's consent management requirements, our new requirements, which we announced on May 16th, and I'll cover a bit later. This webinar is going to be a bit of a 101 course, so reviewing some core concepts. So for some of you, this may be a review. For others, this will be totally new information. Regardless, I hope it is useful for everyone watching. The second goal is to review the consent management requirements themselves. So I hope you all come away understanding what those requirements are and what steps you should take as an AdSense, AdMob, or Ad Manager partner. And then at the end, we'll answer some common questions that a lot of you probably have, and hopefully that provides some clarity. The agenda for this webinar, I'll start with an introduction. So I'll set the table for the rest of the presentation. Then we're going to talk a bit about European regulations and consent. Essentially, why do we have to ask for consent in the first place in Europe? Then I'm going to kind of introduce you to the user consent journey, right? So this will help contextualize everything we cover in the webinar and help contextualize asking for consent in Europe. I'll then talk about the concept of consent management platforms, or CMPs, the IAB Transparency and Consent Framework, or the TCF. I'll wrap up with some key takeaways and Q&A. I'll note that as I go through this, I'll say things like CMPs and TCF. If you're not familiar with those yet, don't worry. I will be covering them in this presentation. So if I mention it, you're not sure what that is, I will touch on that later. So let's set the table with the introduction. So why are we here, right? Right off the bat, I just want to make sure that everyone is aware that later this year, we're going to be requiring all partners using our publisher products, so that's Google AdSense, Ad Manager, and AdMob, to use a Google certified CMP that is integrated with the IAB TCF when serving ads to users in the European Economic Area or the United Kingdom, right? So let me kind of demystify that a bit. Essentially, if you are serving ads to users in Europe, later this year, we're going to require that you use a Google certified CMP that is TCF integrated. I'll explain what being a Google certified CMP means a bit later, as well as the TCF. But please be aware of this. If you're going to take away anything, please take away this and ensure that by later this year, you have a Google certified CMP solution in place. Why are we creating this requirement? I'm going to kind of walk through a couple reasons and talk a bit about certification. So the first reason we're creating this requirement, the Google Consent Management requirement, is that Google has always been committed to giving users transparency and control over how their data is processed, especially in the context of Europe, right? And we already have something called our EU user consent policy. So we already require via policy, Google policy, that publishers that are serving ads in Europe ask users for consent before data processing or doing any sort of ads personalization. So we already have a requirement in place that is reflective of this commitment. This new consent management requirement evolves that requirement, which I just mentioned, and that commitment. Now, instead of having just a simple policy requiring the publishers do it, with the TCF, which is this next middle column, we'll be able to confirm on every ad request what the user has or has not consented to. And you may be asking, okay, why the IAB TCF? Well, the TCF is an industry standard. It's a technical framework that was developed and turned into a standard that kind of standardizes the way that consent is gathered and then passed through the ad ecosystem or ad supply chain, right? And we at Google believe standards are a good thing. We advocate for industry standards. We think they support consistent experiences for users. They support consistent experience for you, our partners. And we think generally they are a good thing. And in the space of consent and consent gathering in Europe, the TCF is the main standard. So that is why we are proceeding with the IAB-TCF as a requirement. And then why are we certifying CMPs? If you're already familiar with the TCF, you may be aware that they already have their own validation or certification process for CMPs. So why are we, Google, also certifying CMPs? Well, we just want to ensure that when a CMP is talking to Ad Manager, AdSense, or AdMob, and it has the TCF integrated, that it essentially works, right? We want to make sure that the TCF has been integrated with that CMP in such a way that it works with your Google Ads technology, right? So we're just checking that and assuming that it does, the CMP will be certified. So that's not having just kind of covered, right? Like the impetus for all of this. Why are we creating this requirement, or rather what the requirement is? Let's chat a bit about some core concepts, starting with the idea of, why do we even have to ask for user consent for online advertising in Europe today? So why do we have to ask for user consent? There are kind of two key reasons. There are two regulations that were put into place, two laws in Europe over the last couple decades. The first is GDPR, which is a European data protection law, and it entered into force in 2018. And the second is the e-privacy directive, another European data protection law, which entered into force in 2002. So let's deep dive each of those to better understand why they require us in the ad tech ecosystem to gather consent from European users. Starting with the GDPR, which I mentioned entered into force in 2018, the GDPR, or General Data Protection Regulation, requires consent for a couple things. One, it requires you to ask for users' consent to essentially get their permission or to have the legal basis to process their personal data. Essentially, the law says you can't process personal data of a user in Europe, a European user, unless you have their consent to do so. So that's one reason we have to ask for consent. The GDPR also states something else. It states that users must have sufficient transparency into the ad tech vendors and ad tech players who are processing their data. So they have to know who is processing the data. And we also have to give users control over how that data is processed, right? So as part of this process and part of this exercise of gathering the user's consent, we also need to give them transparency and control over how the data is processed in the first place. The second regulation that is relevant here, or law, is the e-privacy directive, and also nicknamed the cookie directive. And the e-privacy directive regulates the processing of personal data in the electronic communication sector. So in short, online, the internet, right, affecting our business. And what's important to know here is, among other things, it also provides rules on storing and accessing data on a user's device, such as browser cookies. So in short, right, the e-privacy e-privacy directive established the law that in order to use browser cookies, right, and with users, you need to get their consent to do so, right? So establish the need to ask for consent to use cookies in the context of the internet, of course, in Europe. So with the GDPR, right, requiring consent for the processing of personal data, and the GDPR also requiring that we give users transparency and control over how that data is processed, in addition to the e-privacy directive, which establishes the need to gather consent for the use of non-essential cookies, right? Those two things together are kind of the core reasons that we need to ask users for consent today when serving ads to them in Europe. So let's contextualize this a bit more with the user consent journey, right? So if we look at this slide, we see two green boxes on here, right? Those green boxes are you. This is simplified a bit, but think of those as you, right? When a user visits your website or your app, right, that's step one. And then step 8, right, is that in the bottom right-hand corner here, is that an ad is shown to the user. But there's lots of things in Europe that happen in between. And I'm going to cover these in the coming slides. But just quickly, step 2, after a user visits your website or app, a CMP message is displayed to that user, right? Essentially think of it as like a pop-up that is a message to the user where the user, step 3, makes consent choices, right? They say, I do consent to this, I don't consent to that. As well as making consent choices, that message also provides the transparency that I was talking about earlier and the control I was talking about earlier. The CMP message shows who are the ad tech vendors who are involved in data processing and what they're doing with that data, how they are processing it. And the user, via that message, has the ability to make consent choices, yes or no, based upon what they want. Once those consent choices are made, those are coded into what's called a TC string. I'll cover this more later, but essentially a TC string is something that was created under the TCF, and it's a series of numbers, essentially a binary series of numbers that the user's consent choices are coded into, and that is passed, step 5, to Google. We, on an ad request, we, Google, taken that TC string, and along with other ad tech vendors, we read the TC string. Remember, the TC string represents the user's consent choices, what they have or have not consented to. So when we, Google, and when ad tech vendors read that consent string, we are reading the user's consent choices, which allows us to proceed to step 7, which is select an ad based upon those users' consent choices. The right ad experience, whether that's a personalized ad or non-personalized ad, or whatever else it might be. And then step 8, once that choice has been made, once that ad has been selected, we're back to you. The ad is shown to your user on your website or your app, right? I'll continue to review this and kind of cover how the different elements of this journey come to play, but this is the user consent journey at a high level. So let's dive a bit into consent management platforms, or as you'll hear me refer to them and are commonly referred to in the industry, CMPs. So what is a consent management platform? Consent management platforms are technology solutions that publishers and app developers use in order to facilitate the collection of user consent, right? So you may be familiar with Google CMP. We do have one. It's called Google Consent Management Solutions. It is in the privacy and messaging tab in your AdSense, Ad Manager, and AdMob accounts. And typically, CMPs offer the following features. User messaging, right? So that messaging that I spoke about earlier that lists who are the ad tech vendors who are processing users' data. How are the ad tech vendors processing that data, right? Those are a couple examples, but these are kind of the messages and the information that CMPs will help convey to a user when they visit your website or your app. The second critical thing they do is consent collection. So based upon the advertising activities and use cases you have, you will ask the user for different types of consent. I'll cover that a bit later, but CMPs facilitate that consent collection, right? As you can kind of see here on this image on the right, there are toggles typically in the consent message where the user can say, I do consent to this, I don't consent to that. The other thing that's important to note about CMPs is they often integrate with industry standards, like the IAB-TCF, which we'll cover in a minute and is critical to this conversation. So you can think of a CMP as a technology solution that'll help you gather and manage user consent. And the TCF, the IAB-TCF, is a layer on top of that, an industry standard, a way of asking users for consent and messaging users that the industry has adopted as a standard. And I'll note that most CMPs offer the above solutions for both web and app publishers. So what is a Google certified CMP, right? This is this concept we're introducing with this new requirement. I'll just repeat again before I kind of dive into what it means to be a certified CMP, that by later this year, publishers and developers must use a Google certified CMP when serving ads to users in the EEA, European Economic Area, and UK. I'll note that this requirement only applies to Europe, right? So you don't need to use a CMP. Rather, this Google consent management requirement doesn't apply to your ad serving outside of the European Economic Area in the UK. And it's also important to note that if you are not able to or don't adopt a Google certified CMP by the deadline, which we'll have at a later date, only limited ads are going to be eligible to serve. So what are limited ads? I'll jump ahead a slide, then come back to this and talk about Google certified CMPs. So limited ads are a type of ad serving that gives you, the publisher, the ability to serve ads in a limited way, hence the name, in the absence of a certified CMP. And some important things to know about limited ads. They are limited. Programmatic demand is not eligible for limited ads. So if a limited ad is serving, it won't allow for the serving of programmatic guaranteed deals on Ad Manager, preferred deals or private auction deals, or open auction demand, right? So it is quite limited, and it's only available to Ad Manager and AdMob. So if you're an AdSense publisher, this doesn't apply to you if you do not use a Google certified CMP, right? This will even have more impact on you. Limited ads won't be available. For limited ads, they allow for reservation, so direct deals in Ad Manager, and mediation demand, right? So mediation in AdMob and in Ad Manager and App. And they allow for partial targeting and partial reporting. I want to stress that they are limited, so it would make sense as a business to go ahead and find the right certified CMP for you and ensure you have one ready before we launch this requirement in full. So going back to what certification requires, it's quite straightforward, right? So the certification of a CMP requires that a CMP has integrated with the IAB TCF and meets the TCF's specifications, right? We will audit CMP implementations to ensure that they've implemented the TCF correctly. We will recertify CMPs every 6 months. And I'll note that CMPs can apply for certification today. You can already apply. We already have 23 CMPs certified that you can choose from, right? And there is going to be a resource guide sent out to you after this with links to the list of certified CMPs that you can choose from, including Google CMP, consent management solutions, as well as 21 or so non-Google CMPs, which are all also great options as well. So we suggest you kind of research which CMP is going to be right for you in your business, and proceed with that Google certified CMP. I'll also note that the list of certified CMPs will continue to be updated on a rolling basis. So when I last checked, there were 22, but we will continue to add new CMPs to the list to choose from as they certify, right? So that's maybe one action item I would take after this webinar is go look at that list and start to explore which certified CMP is right for your business. The other thing that I'll note is that we have Google's own CMP, which is certified. We have non-Google CMPs, some 20 to 22 of them, which are certified today, all options for you. Kind of the other bucket is maybe you've built your own consent management solution. Maybe you have your own CMP in-house that you've built, right? That can also be certified. We can also certify in-house CMPs as well. What you would just need to do first is ensure that your CMP is TCF validated, right? That you've gone through the TCF certification process, integration process. Once you've done that, then you would apply to be certified by Google. Assuming your TCF implementation is correct, we would certify you, and your own in-house CMP will be certified as well. So you have options. The best place to start is by looking at the list of certified CMPs today. And if you or your CMP want to apply for certification, a link to do that is also available in the Help Center. We'll send out all those links after this webinar. I covered limited ads. So let me touch for a moment on our own CMP, Google's Consent Management Solutions offering. So you will find this in the Privacy and Messaging tab in your AdSense, Ad Manager, or AdMob interface. It is available again across all three of those products. For web, you just need to, if you're a web publisher, right, you don't have any app inventory, setting up is very straightforward. You go into the Privacy and Messaging tab, click into the GDPR bucket there, right, the kind of selection for GDPR, which is for Europe, and you set up a consent message. It takes a couple of clicks to set that up. You hit publish, and you're done, right? That CMP is Google certified. It will cover this requirement. So you could do that today after this call. you would be all set and have no more action to take. Also, I would suggest looking at the list of other other certified CMPs, not Google's own CMP, but the other non-Google CMPs, and explore those a bit as well. Maybe some of those are a better fit for your business, and it probably behooves you to do a little research, but know that Google's CMP is an option, right? It is certified already, and it is free of charge. So that is an option for you as well, and something that I would explore as part of your approach as a potential solution. Okay, so let's go back to the user consent journey. We just covered CMPs. Let's talk about where they fit into this user consent journey. As I mentioned in stage 1 or step 1, a user visits your website or your app, right? The CMP part of this consent journey begins at stage 2, right? That kind of consent management solution, that consent management platform will pop up that message and it'll be displayed to the user, right? That message will allow the user to make consent choices, look at the ad tech vendors, right? Provide that transparency and see what the ad tech vendors, how they're processing the data. But the CMP helps collect that user consent, right? And then the CMP will turn those user consent choices, because the CMP is TCF integrated, it will turn those consent choices into the TC string, right? Essentially coding those user consent choices into a set of numbers that can be passed on the ad request to Google, right? And that's step 5, which we'll get into in a minute. So let's talk a bit about the transparency and consent framework. I've mentioned this a lot, so obviously let's chat a bit about it. So the IAB's transparency and consent framework was created by Europe's Interactive Advertising Bureau, the European Interactive Advertising Bureau, to help vendors and businesses comply with GDPR and e-privacy directive, right? The 2 regulations that I mentioned earlier that are kind of the core context behind why we need to ask for users for consent in Europe. In short, welcome to read this text, but in short, the TCF is a technical framework, a technical specification that has been adopted by the online advertising industry. And that technical specification lays out a standard for gathering consent from users and then propagating that consent across the advertising supply chain. I'll go into details on what all of that means in a minute, but just know it's kind of this standard way that was created by the IAB, a standard way for gathering user consent and sending that consent along to different ad tech vendors. So what are some key elements of the TCF, right? The IAB TCF. It has 3 major components. The first is the Global Vendor List, or GVL, right? So the IAB requires that all ad tech vendors, including Google, register how they process user data, right? So this is kind of tying back to that transparency element. If you are a ad tech vendor who is registered for the TCF, you've said how you're going to use that user's data that you are asking consent for, right? So that is a key element of it. The second part is kind of the consent management platform integration. So the TCF lays out a set of policies for how CMPs can ask their users to make choices about data use. And this includes the concept of TCF purposes, which I will cover in a minute. But in short, essentially, the TCF standardizes the way in which CMPs ask for user consent, right? So if you go to a TCF integrated CMP and website, they're going to be pretty similar in how they display the consent message to the user, because there's a standardized way that the IAB has laid out in order to ask for consent. And then the third part is the TC string, or transparency and consent string, right? And as I've mentioned, you see kind of those 1s and 0s there, right? That's pretty much what it looks like. The user has made a consent choice, a number of consent choices. Those consent choices are codified into that series of numbers, right? So maybe a 1 is a yes and a 0 is a no, for example. Those numbers are then passed on to Google and other ad tech vendors who read that string. And when they read that string, they know exactly what a user has or has not consented to. Something I want to be clear here about is that you as a publisher do not have to integrate with the IAB TCF. This is not something that you need to integrate with yourself. It is something that your CMP needs to be sure that they are integrated with, right? So you choose your CMP, your Google certified CMP, and your Google certified CMP has done the TCF integration work. So assuming you choose the Google certified CMP, there's no sort of TCF integration that you, the publisher, have to do. Just want to make sure that's clear. Now I'm going to dive a bit into what the TCF purposes are, captured by this middle column here on this slide. So what are the TCF purposes? So this is kind of that standardized way of asking users for consent. What you should know is that essentially what the TCF purposes are, they are different advertising use cases or activities, data processing activities, maybe think of it that way, that a user may or may not consent to, right? And they address different advertising use cases. So let's take some examples. If we look at purpose one, right, which is to store and or access information on a device, right? If you were to go to the TCF's website, the IAB's website, and look at the TCF purposes there, this is exactly what it would say, right? Store and or access information on a device. It's a standard, right, across the TCF. So what is purpose one? Essentially, that's, hey, user, you're asking the user for consent to use cookies, use app IDs, user IDs, essentially that sort of thing, as an example. Let's look at purpose four, right? You would be asking, if you ask the user for consent for purpose four, you'd be asking the user, hey, can I personalize ads for you? But the purposes don't just address use cases like ads personalization. They also address use cases like measuring and reporting. So for example, purpose seven, right? You would be asking the user, if the user is consenting to purpose seven, you'd be asking the user for permission to measure app performance and do reporting. So if we look there on the right of the screen, that little screenshot actually is a screenshot, a TCF consent message of Google CMP, right? Just as an example. And we see there on the screen, right, purpose one and purpose two. If you were to scroll down on that screenshot, can't scroll on a screenshot, but I think you get the idea. If you were to scroll down, you would see purpose, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and so on. And if we look there, right, on the screen, purpose one, that's store and or access information on a device. Purpose two, select basic ads. So hopefully it helps you tie this concept together. These purposes are the things that you're asking the user for consent to do when you have a CMP that's integrated with the TCF. So these are the TCF purposes. So let's kind of tie this together with how these purposes would actually translate into the type of ad that is served on your site. So in practice, in this kind of very straightforward scenario, let's say a user comes to your site, the CMP message pops up, the message contains the things that the user can consent to or choose not to consent to, right? And listed out are the different purposes that the user can select from, right? Let's say the user just clicks accept all, right? And I think, yeah, on this screenshot, you can see there would be a accept all button, right? That means the user's not scrolling through on a purpose by purpose basis and choosing things. They're just saying, you know what, I accept all purposes, I consent to everything, let's move on. In that scenario, right, as you see here on the right, all those green check boxes, then it's likely that personalized ads are served, right? Because everything has been consented to, the user's given us permission, we can measure ad performance, do reporting, all kind of things that you're used to doing today. Let's take an example where the user doesn't consent to everything. This gets a bit into the weeds, and I don't want to kind of get too far into the weeds here, but what I want you to take away is this as an example where the user has chosen to not consent to everything. Let's say the user goes into that list of purposes, says, yes, I consent to purpose one, I don't consent to some of them. There's something called legitimate interest available for others. Again, without getting into the weeds, the idea here is the user just doesn't consent to everything, right? The outcome would be that only non-personalized ads are eligible to serve, right? So ads that are not personalized to that user. So what I kind of want to illustrate here as is that depending on what the user chooses to consent to or not consent to, different sort of ad experiences and types of ads will be available to serve to the user. So let's put it all together, right? The user visits a website or an app, right? The CMP message is displayed to the user. That is, the user makes consent choices. That's coded into a TC string. The TC string is passed to Google. And then what happens? Putting it all together, step 8, right? An ad is selected from the user's consent choices. Remember, in stage 2, we displayed the different purposes to the user. In stage 3, the user has made consent choices based on what they do or do not want to happen, or how they want their data to be processed. Those consent choices are coded into a TC string, right, involving the CMP and the TCF. That TC string is passed to Google. We, Google, and vendors, other ad tech vendors involved, read that TC string, right? We read the user's consent choices. Based upon reading that, right, the last 2 slides, an ad is selected from the user's consent choices. So again, if they consent to everything, the ad selected would likely be a personalized ad. If they only consent to some things, maybe it's a non-personalized ad, right? A different sort of ad selection happens though. And then we get to step 8, the ad is shown to the user. So in between step 1, user visiting your website or app, and step 8, the CMP, TCF, and Google and other vendors all play a role. And of course, most importantly, the user's consent choice all play a role in determining which ad is shown to the user on stage 8. So what are some key takeaways from all of this, right? I just want to hammer home one more time that by later this year, you will need to use a Google certified CMP when serving ads to users in the European Economic Area and the UK. So we can just shorthand it to Europe. And if you do not adopt a certified CMP, for Ad Manager and AdMob customers, limited ads will be eligible to serve. Unfortunately, for AdSense, limited ads are not available. So it definitely behooves you to review the list of certified CMPs, which we'll send out to you after this, and do some research and find the one that is the right fit for your business. Adopt a certified CMP by the deadline later this year. Many top CMPs are already validated. I'll note. You'll see on there. So you have quite a bit of options today. And if you have your own CMP, as it notes there, you can begin applying for certification already if you have an in-house CMP. How should you proceed? Well, that depends on your CMP status. Let's say you're already using a TCF CMP today, right? You already have a CMP implemented. You know it's TCF integrated. What next step should you take? Step 1 is check the list of certified CMPs to ensure your CMP is certified. If they are a TCF CMP and they're not certified, right, have them apply for certification. It's a quick process, roughly 10 business days, and you should be all set. If you're using a CMP today, but it's not a TCF CMP, you should encourage your CMP to go integrate with the TCF. And once they've integrated with the TCF, then they should apply to get certified with Google, right? So reach out to your CMP and help them initiate this process, whether that's a CMP you've built or a third-party CMP. And if you have no CMP at all, then go check out the list of certified CMPs, again, which we'll send to you after this, to find the right CMP for you, whether that's Google's consent management solution, which you could turn on in your AdSense, Ad Manager, AdMob UI, or a non-Google solution, right? They have many non-Google CMPs have easy setups as well. So do some research, find out what's best for your business, choose a CMP, and implement it so you're ready for later this year. Now let's dive into some common questions that we've received from the attendees of this webinar. Where can you verify if a CMP is certified by Google? I've mentioned this a bunch, but I'm going to mention it again because it's really important. There is a list of certified CMPs that is available in our AdSense, Ad Manager, and AdMob help centers. We'll send you the link to that after this, but you can go look it up today. And that list is the source of truth. If you see a CMP on there, it will be Google certified, and it will also note whether that CMP supports web and app, right? Web and app use cases for AdMob publishers, or just web, right? And based upon whether or not they support your use case, you should check out their website, see if they're a good fit for you, and explore the certified CMPs via that list. Also note, if you already have a CMP and you want to know if they've certified, that list is also the right place to look. How do you implement Google's consent management solution? If you determine that Google's consent management solution is right for you, then in the privacy and messaging tab in your product UI, right? If you're a web publisher, you're monetizing web property, then it just takes a few clicks. You go into the privacy and messaging tab, you select GDPR, you set up your consent message, and then you publish it. It just takes a few clicks. It's very easy to do. And it's also easy on app as well. As I mentioned earlier, the Google's consent management solution is bundled with the GMA SDK already. So if you have the GMA SDK in place, it's just a few extra steps, a little bit of coding to get our Google CMP set up. But if you're comfortable setting up the SDK, you'll be comfortable setting up Google's consent management solution. In both cases, it's pretty straightforward to enable. What are the benefits of our solution, right? The benefits are, one, as I just mentioned, it's simple to set up. Two, it's Google certified. So if you implement it, you will be all set for the requirement later this year. Three, obviously, it covers the European use case. And four, it's free to use, free of charge, no additional cost. But I would also encourage you to check out some of the other CMPs that are on our certified CMP list. Google solution is kind of an out-of-the-box solution, right? Other CMPs have out-of-the-box solutions as well, in addition to more customization features. So if you have a more complex setup and you want a higher level of customization for your CMP, one of the third-party non-Google CMPs may be right for you instead. So again, I suggest you look at that list, do some research, and figure out the best path forward for your business. How do you configure a CMP to show non-personalized ads to users that don't consent? So the nice thing about having a CMP that's integrated with the TCF, Google's integrated with the TCF as well, right? Ad Manager, AdSense, and AdMob. You don't really need to do anything. So the user would come to your site. We would display the consent message. The CMP would display the consent message. If the user does not consent to some of the purposes, and that only allows for non-personalized ads to serve, that'll happen automatically. You don't need to do anything. We, Google, read the TC string. We determine, hey, based upon the user's consent choices, only non-personalized ads are eligible to serve, and that's the only thing that we would make available to serve. So if you have a CMP in place that's a TCF CMP, Google certified, there are not really any steps you need to take as a publisher. Is it necessary to use a CMP if you turn off personalized ads? So the answer in Europe is yes, right? Without getting too much into the weeds, still our non-personalized ad solution still leverages a cookie for spam and fraud detection, for example, for things like frequency capping, for example. And if you recall back to GDPR and e-privacy, we do need to ask for consent for cookie usage, right? So in the case of non-personalized ads, we still need consent for purpose one, right, in order to serve non-personalized ads. So in short, yes, if you are if you have European traffic and you want to set up a certified CMP, right, for that traffic, then if you have European traffic, then you should set up a Google certified CMP to make sure you're prepared for this requirement. What are the implications of not doing this, of not implementing a Google certified CMP? As I mentioned, for Ad Manager and AdMob, only limited ads would be available to you, right? No programmatic demand. For Ad Manager, only reservation demand. For AdMob, only mediation demand, right? And limited targeting, limited reporting, so on and so forth. So essentially, your monetization would be heavily restricted. So it definitely behooves you to ensure you have a certified CMP in place by our deadline later this year. And so make sure you're prepared. Unfortunately, if you're AdSense, limited ads isn't available. So if you're an AdSense publisher, definitely make sure you have a certified CMP set up. So again, you as well are prepared for the requirement, the enforcement of the requirement later in this year. Will Google's new consent management requirement help us improve our eCPM? So generally, this requirement isn't about optimizing or maximizing performance, right? If we think back to the regulations, right, that I covered earlier in Google's EU user consent policy, this launch is about making sure that in Europe we are respecting users' consent choices, right? By law, they have the right to consent or not consent to different data processing activities. And this launch is about ensuring that, we, Google, you, the publisher, app developer, all the ad tech vendors, we're respecting what the user has or has not consented to. There may be an edge case where if you only serve if you only serve non-personalized ads to users in Europe today, and you all of a sudden implement a CMP, now you're going to start getting some personalized ads as well because users will have consented to that. So you may see an uptick in eCPM, but that's a small edge case. In general, again, this launch is about ensuring we're respecting users' consent choices on an ad request by ad request basis. What action do I have to take? I'm not very technical. So if you're not very technical and kind of the idea of having to implement a CMP feels pretty overwhelming, I want to say that there are a lot of great options for you. Generally, you should look at all the certified CMPs on the list. Many have easy to implement, out-of-the-box solutions. So do the research, figure out which one is right for you, and proceed with that. I'll also note again that Google's consent management solution, if you're monetizing web in Europe, then you can just go into your privacy and messaging tab, click a few buttons there, and you will have your CMP set up. You'll be done. There's no coding involved. It uses your already in place GPT tag. There's no really extra work other than 5 to 10 minutes of clicking a few buttons. On app, there is a little bit of technical work. You need to do a tiny bit of additional coding on top of your SDK. But if you implemented your SDK already, this should be a breeze for you. That's an option too as well on app. So, whether you're finding a non-Google CMP that has an out-of-the-box non-technical solution for you, right? A good choice. Or you're, choosing Google's consent management solution, kind of going into your UI and just setting it up there. Also a good choice. There are many non-technical solutions and paths available to you as a publisher. I'll also note that we will do another webinar. If this is kind of the 101, that will be the 201, the next step, where we'll cover a bit more of each of those options, including Google's consent management solution, other consent management solutions as well, and give you an idea of some approaches you might be able to take there. We serve a very minor number of ads in Europe and the UK, largely the US. Will this requirement only affect serving ads in those territories or across the account in general? So this only affects serving ads in Europe and the UK, right? So this doesn't apply outside of the European Economic Area in the UK. That said, even if you have a very minor number of ads or users in Europe, I still think it behooves you to get a CMP set up. Find a very lightweight, out-of-the-box CMP offering, something that'll take not that long to set up. That way you can kind of continue to monetize, even if it's a little bit of traffic, monetize your European traffic fully. It shouldn't take very long to set up, and that way you're not kind of losing all monetization or severely restricting it there altogether. And that's it. Thank you very much for attending. I mentioned a lot of links and resources over the course of this presentation. What you see here are a number of resources, which I'll just quickly walk through now. If you want to see the list of Google certified CMPs and learn more about what this requirement means for you, there are links to our Ad Manager, AdSense, and AdMob help centers that detail that and contain the list of certified CMPs, which we'll send to you. If you are if you're curious about what certification looks like for CMPs, or you have your own in-house CMP and you want to understand the requirements or even apply for Google certification, there are links that we'll send out to you that cover all of those with the application there, link at the bottom. And then finally, if you're curious about Google's own consent management solution, right, the one you can turn on by going into your privacy and messaging tab, you can go into, it is Google certified, and you can go into those help centers linked there to learn more about that. Thank you very much for your time. Hopefully this is useful. Please, before we send these resources to you, we ask that you do fill out the feedback form, which is live already. I think it's been live for about 10 or 15 minutes. We really want to get your feedback so we can understand whether this was useful, what additional information you need to help make this transition, and what other sort of resources or webinars we might be able to put on. And then, of course, again, once you fill that out, we can send you those resources, which I just mentioned on the previous slide. So again, thank you very much. Hopefully this was helpful. Have a nice day.